Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at SAS Innovate. My name is Joy DeBolt. I'm on the marketing team, and we are thrilled that you have been with us the past few days. We are going to wrap up this wonderful week with a great presentation. I'm very excited for an Ask Me Anything with Mary Osborne, Product Manager. So I have the pleasure of introducing Mary. Let's give her a warm welcome.
So I wasn't sure how this was going to go today at 11:30 on Friday after the party last night. So I really deeply appreciate everyone showing up and being willing to hopefully talk to me. When they put these types of sessions on as an option, I thought this would be kind of fun. When I talked to my husband about it, he was like, "Are you sure you're ready for something like that?" And I was like, "Dude, people ask me questions all the time, so let's see what you got." Does anyone have any questions about large language models or natural language processing? Anybody willing to? Oh, yay, you'll open it up for us.
All right, my first question is, will there ever be an industry standard benchmark to measure large LLMs?
I love that question because what it sounds like to me is you're asking about maybe how we evaluate and ensure that they're behaving properly. That is one of my soapbox items. I've been preaching about that all week and well before to anybody who will listen. It's really difficult right now to gauge how well LLMs are doing. And in the industry, one of the standards that we use that is always brought to bear is something called a BLEU score. I'm a natural language processing person. As I touch my microphone, sorry about that. I'm a natural language processing person. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And BLEU scores were designed for evaluating machine translation models, not LLMs. So it's like this metric that's been kind of shoehorned in there, even though it's not necessarily the most appropriate. I think we are still at a point where the technology is rather nascent, and we have to come up with really good ways to gauge how well the models are doing. But in order to gauge how well the model's doing, you have to have a baseline to compare against. And the baseline is typically the part that's missing, because that takes a lot of work. When I talk about baselines, what I'm expecting to see is when you define your use case for an LLM, it should be a fairly well-scoped, very narrow use case, and you should have some idea of the types of questions your users are going to ask. And if you know the questions your users are going to ask, you should also have potential answers that you would expect the model to return. That gives you a gold standard set of prompts and responses. And it does take a little bit of work. It's almost like training your model. There's some work you have to do on the front end in order to get the good success on the back end. So once you have a gold standard, you can do all kinds of things. So some of the things that we're doing in SAS NLP R&D is we're looking at novel methods to determine how well an LLM is doing. And it's not just a BLEU score. There are other scores that you may hear. There are mover scores, there's Rouge. Rouge is a weird one for me because that was designed for summarization tasks, which is still not novel text generation. So it's another shoehorning in thing. What we're looking at is how do we assess relevancy of response? And that helps us gauge whether or not the model is meandering towards an answer. Because if you're deploying a bot, you want your model to respond in a concise way that gets to the point really quickly, unlike what I'm doing in this answer. So if your model is overly friendly, I'm really glad you asked this question. Here's some things we can think about. Nobody cares, just give me the answer. If it's meandering, it's probably hallucinating, even though it's not giving you a wrong answer, it's just not giving you what you're looking for. So we want to gauge relevancy of response. But we also want to look at consistency, because in your organization, people are going to ask the same questions multiple times. And if they do that and the model doesn't respond in a consistent fashion, all of a sudden you have multiple people in your organization who are getting different versions of the truth. And if working at SAS for almost 27 years has taught me anything, it's we want one version of the truth. So we want to assess consistency. And a lot of the techniques that we're looking at to do things like this stem from our deep knowledge in natural language processing. We're not just structured machine learning folks. We understand language, and I have linguists, and we're looking at all sorts of different methods to try to gauge how well the model's responding in an area where there are no best practices, and it's like the Wild Wild West. So hopefully eventually, like I said, as I meander towards the answer, hopefully eventually we'll get to a point where we will have better standards and more consistent metrics than something like a blue score or a rouge score. We'll get you.
So large language models are a fairly new thing. Where do you see them in, say, 5-10 years being used? Because I have a hard time believing that just prompt and response is their end.
Right. And it's interesting because when OpenAI first started developing the GPT model, it wasn't originally designed to do question and answer. The question and answer properties came out as an emergent property of large language models. So they do a really good job at summarization. They found that they did a pretty good job of question and answer to some extent, given good prompts. I think the technology will continue to mature as it does. I think what's going to happen more than anything is people are going to mature about the technology and figure out that not every problem that involves unstructured data or even question and answer requires something like a large language model. Because we're going to get to a point where as more organizations implement large language models, there are implications that go well beyond the technology. I mean, there are energy implications, there's water usage, there's all kinds of things that are sort of the unspoken downsides of large language models. I think what we'll find is people are going to start moving more towards some of the smaller language models because they're going to be less expensive to run. And we're going to find better use cases. It's not going to be like the example that Brian talked about on stage during opening session, where we're going to ask a large language model to determine whether or not someone should get a loan. That is a terrible use case, no matter how you slice it. So I think we're going to learn some organizations through really horrific PR. I think we're going to learn where the appropriate use cases are. I don't know that people always ask me if we're going to get to a point where large language models won't hallucinate. No, there's no way. So if you are hearing in the market people saying, we can give you 0 hallucinations, that is marketing. That is not real. The only way to guarantee 0 hallucinations in a large language model is to bypass the large language model. That's pretty much where I think we're going to learn more as people, and the shiny hype will start to die down, and we'll find legitimate use cases that can actually bring us an ROI, because that's something else people aren't talking about right now. When I talk to an organization and I say, I have some techniques that you can use to help cut down on your costs of LLMs, I have some people that'll come to me and say, we're not worried about the cost. And I'll think, it's because you haven't implemented anything yet. So when you do, we can talk about ways to reduce the costs. So I think it's going to be more of a people thing than a technology thing.
Hey, 4 questions in your, I'm here.
Sorry, I was like, where's the voice coming from?
4 questions in your introduction bring me here. So can you address those 4 questions, maybe?
Oh, are those here?
Yeah.
Aha. Okay. One of the questions I get asked very frequently is, what is NLP? NLP is more than just large language models. That is another one of my soapbox items. NLP is a technology that's been around for decades and saw a really big rise in terms of things like search. So NLP is the ability to analyze unstructured data. Unstructured typically meaning text, could mean a combination of text and numbers. So that's pretty much what NLP is. NLP as a practice has been around since the 1940s. The very first language model, not large language model, but the very first word predicting language model was developed in the 1940s by a man named Claude Shannon. He's the father of information theory. And he was very interested in how you could move more data across a wire. He was interested in telephony and what happens if the signal breaks down. So if the signal breaks down, how can you predict what sections of the conversation were lost? So he developed something called an engram, which many of you may have heard about, which basically says, depending on the order of the engram, if I have 2 words like I like, it's really difficult to predict that next word. It could be toast, it could be sunshine, it could be anything. But if you increase the order of the engram and say, I like cheese and blank on my pizza, you might say pepperoni. So depending on the order and the number of words you give preceding the one you're trying to predict, we predict. That same level of technology is pretty much what is foundational to large language models. It's still just a next word predictor, but the benefits now are the models can see crazy amounts of data. And with a probabilistic model, the more information it sees, the better the outcome, or the output predictions. And no, I just answered, did text generation start with large language models? No, it was in the 1940s. LLMs understand, and that's anthropomorphizing a model, but large language models and large language models understand human language because they're fed tremendous amounts of training data. So the more information that's in the training data, apparently I can't click, the more information that's in the training data, the better the outcome predictions. So again, the large language models weren't developed to do question and answer necessarily. They were developed to do novel text generation, and the question answer part was just emergent, something cool that they found. And we know that if you give really good prompts, you get better responses. So again, the more information the model sees, if you want to anthropomorphize it, the better the predictions. Some of the challenges in training LLMs, the biggest challenge is energy, resources, GPU, time. And of course we can add in expense because all of those things add up. So it takes a tremendous amount of energy, a lot of expensive hardware to train an LLM. So people will come to me a lot and they'll say, I would like to start from scratch because I understand that there are challenges in the way the models were pre-trained because we don't know what's in them. So if I want to create a model that isn't rife with bias, maybe I want to choose my own data and start from scratch. And that's great, but it's going to cost a lot of money. So that's the reason people continue to go back to the pre-trained models. So that's actually one of the bigger issues in training, and the fact that it can be really difficult, even if if your main goal is to create a model that doesn't have bias. Bias exists in so many different forms. It's kind of hard to have a completely neutral model, especially when you're dealing with language. There are ethical concerns with LLMs in decision making. My favorite example is the one that Brian brings up on stage with the really, 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 really. Adding 4 reallys into a prompt and expecting that that's going to fix bias is ridiculous. I can't even believe they wanted to put their name on that. I wouldn't have. I would have said, you can publish that if you want, but I'm out. So there are some ethical concerns because we don't understand what's in the training data. So if you don't understand what's in that black box, it's really difficult to mitigate what's in that black box. The role of data in training, I've waxed poetic about that. I've become a large language model, moving towards and out of relevancy. The difference between training and fine-tuning. Training provides a linguistic foundation for the model to work with. That's where we might expose the model to the internet. Fine-tuning gives us an opportunity to expose the model to our data. And in doing so, we hope to get to a situation where the model is really good at responding to our questions. And fine-tuning takes a variety of different forms. If we want to get all computer science-y, we can do parameter efficient fine-tuning, which updates, it does something called a gradient update. Gradient updates actually change the underlying data. Most organizations are not going to do that because that's almost as expensive, not quite, but it's pretty expensive on the order of training the model. And it requires expertise that a lot of organizations don't have. So what most organizations will do is they'll choose to go with a retrieval augmented generation system, which gives us an opportunity to create a ground truth sort of data source that a model can search against. So people feel more comfortable with that because it exposes the model to your data in a much more cost-effective way, and that's one of the answers. But something else people don't always consider is you can also expose the model to your data through the prompts. That can be good and bad, depending on what types of models you're using. So that was a very quick overview of a bunch of questions. I would love to answer more of yours.
Hi, I'm a novice to this area, but at the same time, in my organization, one of the most experienced. And we're going to have a vendor come in and demonstrate a product that would help us write clinical protocols.
Okay.
what questions can I ask them to properly evaluate their product?
I would want to know what types of data they're going to introduce in order to do that. So are they taking your data to be able to write those types of protocols? Is that their goal, or do they have something that's packaged industry that they think is going to do a good job of that? Oh, that's the question? Yeah. My first thing would be, what kind of data do you need from us in order to have this application work effectively? And I think creating content is, in some cases, a good idea with large language models. Not always. Any content we create, we should still have humans vet and read, especially when you're talking about protocols, because it is possible for some of the information to be really good, and then when you get a little further into it, have the model start to go a little off the rails. I teach computational linguistics at Duke, and I see this in my students when they think they're going to pull a fast one, and I'll ask them to critique research. So they'll copy and paste the research paper into ChatGPT, ask it to critique it. And the first couple of paragraphs often sound convincing and decent, although not their voice, so I already knew they cheated. But when it starts getting further in, it starts getting, in some cases, more repetitive and sometimes almost nonsensical. But what a lot of people don't do is they don't read past the first couple of paragraphs. Or they'll say, now that I've got this, can you summarize it for me? And I think that is also not a very great idea, because how do you know the summary is any good if you haven't read the original? We're taking a leap of faith. So some of the bigger questions I would ask is, what types of data are you expecting from us in order to make this application work? And more than anything, how are you evaluating whether or not the application's doing a really good job? Because as I mentioned in the first response, evaluation is something that gets glossed over quite a bit. And how are you going to make sure the model's really behaving if you don't have a solid set of evaluation metrics to work from? I would definitely want to know how they're training the model. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi. Ear in front.
Sorry. It's so unsettling because I'm hearing the voice over here. I'm like, oh.
Hi, I'm Eric from the Netherlands, from Notalize. We have a lot of customers asking LLMs and use cases. So, but it's more or less about search.
Sure, yeah.
From you being in this area for more than 20 years, what do you see as the next use case where we can make the difference for our customers and be innovative instead of doing something in search only?
Search is absolutely huge. I mean, that's one of the key tasks for NLP. I think a lot of it's going to be different levels of content generation, honestly. Some of the more tedious things that we don't want to do. I do get a little nervous when people are expecting that these large language models are going to do as good of a job as humans when it comes to things like summarization or creating content. I think people are looking at these as easy buttons, and the results aren't really showing me that in the variety of use cases that I see. But anything we can look at to help facilitate the human creative process, I think is good. I love the brainstorming ideas. I love asking ChatGPT, pretending that I'm somebody, and then asking ChatGPT what types of questions should I be asking. So I'm a chef at a Michelin star restaurant, which I'm a terrible cook. I am a specialist in pastries. I want to create the world's best chocolate chip cookie. What types of questions should I be asking you? And then have it, do that level of creative brainstorming. I think search will continue to exist. It'll continue to be a very key use case, which is why RAG is so popular. It makes people feel much more comfortable because it's old school kind of use case, kind of tried and true with a storyteller on top. So it'll be interesting to see where people start seeing more ROI beyond RAG, honestly.
Hi, yeah, I was just curious. I've had a little experience with LLMs, but one of the things that I guess I find challenging is you know, it's really much based on the prompt you give it. I have to use a lot of reiteration. Sometimes, you know, if you have a long discussion, it completely forgets things. And I was wondering, where do you see that going in the next 5-10 years? Because I know it's storage to
Yes.
hold those conversations and everything, but you know, am I losing the point in the LLM? Should I only be trying to use it for very short discussions, or expect it to be like a human and remember what I was talking to it about before?
Unless you're talking to a human like me who 5 seconds in is like, what was I thinking about? So the forgetting that LLMs do is actually something that's been inherent in our language modeling, even back with the recurrent neural networks before transformers. Recurrent neural networks were much worse about forgetting. If you fed a recurrent neural network a very long sequence, it would forget what happened at the beginning of the sequence and be biased towards the end. And it's interesting when we look at things like prompt comprehensiveness or response comprehensiveness to multi-part prompts. We're doing some work right now in R&D that looks at how different LLMs respond to multi-part prompts. And I have a 5-part prompt that's something like, pretend you're a famous rock star, you're giving an interview, make up some stories about your life, use a conversational tone, and I can't remember what the last part is. So there's 5 parts, but the making up the story, the details about your life, looking at ChatGPT 4o and Claude side by side, both models do really well with the first part of the prompt. They start to decline with the second. Claude falls apart at the third, and then picks back up at the fourth, and then they both do really well at the last part. So it's really interesting having these types of metrics to figure out which model is going to respond more effectively. So that's one thing you could look at is if you have a favorite LLM that you're working with, you could experiment by looking at a different one and see if it responds any differently or if it maintains the line of conversation as well as the other. One of the things we're going to make available are these types of metrics, so organizations can pit one model next to another with the types of prompts that their users are going to be asking and see which model is going to fit most effectively. Because not all models are created equally, and you have to be willing to say, ChatGPT 4o is sort of the gold standard. Other models are coming up, but when we compare them side by side, what's going to do better given multi-part prompts and the fact that we're forcing the model to sort of remember what happened earlier in the conversation. We can make models bigger, we can add more parameters, we can add more hardware, and that can help with some of the memory issues, but that also dramatically increases costs. So there has to be some sort of a balance point, and that's part of why we started researching this response comprehensiveness to prompts, because most people don't do this zero shot, ask a simple question with like 5 words in it and expect a great response. Most people are creating these really elegant prompts, but what happens when it's too elegant? And those are the types of things that we're now starting to look at measuring. So I might have a better answer for you next year.
All right, we have time for about 2 more questions. Good, grab one.
So back to your point about ROI, as a general rubric, it sounded like, and you can correct me if I'm being too specific, but it sounded like if your use case involves needing a human in the loop, which basically doesn't save as much time because you're essentially, still doing the work that you should be doing, that probably you should be leaning towards looking for other ways to improve stuff.
My personal feeling, and this is where some of my colleagues will say, Mary, you're so down on the technology. And I'm really not, but I recognize where the limitations are. And I think anytime you're going to generate content that's going to impact people, that could be a potential PR nightmare at some point, a human needs to be involved in vetting that. It doesn't mean where you get some time savings is they're not having to start from scratch. And sometimes it's that starting from scratch part that takes people the longest. It's that ideation phase. And if you have someone, as I anthropomorphize a model again, if you have someone to sort of bounce ideas off in a very non-judgmental way, Because a lot of people are, if we think about what Brene Brown was talking about with vulnerability and fear, a lot of people are afraid to show the things that they don't know. And it's a lot more comfortable to do that with a prompt and a model that is not judging you. And if you start feeling like you're not smart enough, you can just delete that conversation and move on. And no one's the wiser except for the memory gods out there storing that information somewhere. But I think, I don't know that having a human vet some of the content is going to have as big of a negative impact on ROI as not having a really good, very well scoped use case. And I harp on this all the time, that narrow defined use case, solid use case is key, because I talk to so many people who will say, we want to do generative AI. And I'll say, well, what's your use case? And they'll say, we don't have one. And I think in no other field of analytics would you do something like that. You don't look to apply something to a problem that doesn't exist. You have a problem and you try to find the right solution for that problem. But there are a lot of people trying to, they want to be on the bleeding edge. The bleeding edge is really expensive right now. So it's better to figure out what problems you have in the organization and try to solve those than trying to, shoehorn a large language model in, kind of like our blue scores for evaluation. Yeah, we'll get you.
Hi. Currently, within SAS, you have VTA that is, in my experience, still based on more traditional NLP techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see changes coming to SAS VTA to go along with the more modern embeddings and large language model trends?
Yes, so I'm glad you asked that. VTA is primarily predicated on traditional techniques like linguistic rules models. The interesting thing about that is now those linguistic rule models, because they run so quickly, we're using them to augment and improve outcomes from LLMs. So there were some folks on the AI governance side in the hub earlier this week that may have been showing some of the guardrailing. It's a lot of our linguistic rule models running as the guardrails because they run so fast, and because if you are in any type of a regulated environment, we can peel them back and explain how we got the answers. But the things I've been talking about with respect to evaluation, that's all coming out of my NLP team. And we're trying to figure out where it's going to go. It may not fit into VTA. It may be augmenting things like the Ragu product that is going to have a different name, that was also being displayed in the hub this week. So my R&D team is working on all sorts of modern methods. It's a matter of figuring out where they fit in the stack, because we're going to be making some changes to VTA over the next 12 to 18 months. This is my bread and butter because this is my job. The rest of the stuff is sort of gravy, but we're looking at doing some interesting things, like potentially moving the VTA nodes into VML, so you can work on your text and then feed some of the embeddings into machine learning models downstream. So there's some interesting things that we've got roadmap-wise that include more modern methods. And the majority of the work that my linguist team does actually is using machine learning techniques behind the scenes as we're innovating, and then, like I said, figuring out where that's going to fall in the product stack. And right now, a lot of the work that we've been doing has been done in support of the Copilot initiatives and some of the other products that are floating around and haven't been rolled into VTA. Yeah, so I'm always happy to have roadmap discussions because I've got a big, aggressive one.
Okay, so I just want to mention Perl was created by a linguist, which is pretty funny.
Yes. We love Perl regular expressions in linguistics.
Exactly, exactly. So Mr. Khan left a lasting impression on me from last year,
Mm-hmm.
and one of those was the personality, adjusting the AI to your personality,
Yes.
or the LLM. And, one of my use cases for that is at home, like, I had to tell the LLM that, hey, my son, might be on the spectrum or whatever, but he really likes lizards. And it explains everything in lizards, like, and he's finally able to understand SAS.
Yes.
and understand what I do, because it's like giving him the lizard version of
Yeah.
it. Is SAS working on like that personality type and like an organizational bias? Like we work at a bank and like there is a bias to work a certain way or
Yes.
to give results. Is that part of the roadmap? Or?
Those are things that we experiment with. And I love the lizard thing because I have a spectrum-y kid, middle schooler, who loves dinosaurs. So everything is in terms of dinosaurs, so I can relate to that. And I love the aspect of personality in models. I was actually sad when they turned down the temperature on ChatGPT and made it, all the responses are so academic unless you tweak it, unless you tell it what to do. Because I loved back in the day when it was much more hilarious. And my favorite LLM of all time, which has been retired and turned into Gemini, was Bard, because Bard was off the rails all the time. I could always count on Bard to give me some sort of bizarre response. They had a ton of repetition. It was a terrible language model, but it was hilarious. I mean, I asked it if it was a fan of Eliza, the first chatbot from the 1960s, and it came back and said, you know, Eliza had her differences and she was really good, but I'm better. And I mean, I was like, whoa. Or passing the Turing test. I'm working on ways to better mimic humans so I can pass the Turing test. I'm like, are you now? So they started making more academic responses out of bots because that kind of behavior scared the crap out of people. And they were like, oh my gosh, is this thing sentient? No, it's just crazy. So we do experiments to try to figure out what types of tone models should be responding in. So when you look at any type of guardrailing demos that we have using intelligent decisioning, a lot of them have sentiment models in them, because especially if your bot is not making a lone decision, but if it is delivering the decision and somebody's been declined, the last thing you want is your bot to be overly negative and rude to them and make them feel even worse. Or, you know, you don't want it to be overly jubilant if somebody's been approved. You want it to kind of have a neutral tone. So there's a time and a place for the personality, and I think trying to figure out a consistent way to gauge what that time and place is, that's going to be one of our challenges, because when you come across as too human and almost too likable, it freaks people out. I remember when the language model started going big, I'm a mother of 4, and I was on a bunch of mommy Facebook pages, and people were freaking out because the Snapchat AI had just been released. And there was one woman who said, they're not supposed to know where I am. It's not supposed to know anything about me. But I asked the Snapchat friend where the nearest McDonald's was, and it knew, and it was right. It knows where I am. And I held up my phone, and I was like, no, Janet, this thing has location services on it. The phone knows where you are, and it uses that. And then somebody said something like, I took a photo of my forehead in my car. It knew I was in the car. And I was like, no, Susan, it didn't. That thing also has an accelerometer, and it knows you're not jogging at 55 miles an hour. So then I got responses like, that sounds like something an AI would say, and then I got blocked. So you have to gauge the types of information your bot's giving people, because people are afraid. I mean, those of us that work in tech kind of see it for what it is, but there are people out there that don't work in tech, who play around with the bots, who make friends with the bots. I have students that tell me all about their relationships with the bots. I'm like, okay, you do you, but you might want to get out more. It's wild, and there's still a tremendous amount of fear. And every class that I teach, inevitably, when I say LLMs are not sentient, and then somebody tries to prove me wrong. And the last one was, if anybody remembers early Bing chat in Microsoft, in the Microsoft browser, Bing was off the rails, and Bing could be manipulated to respond in ways that were very inappropriate. So a student this year said, I saw an instance where the bot was saying bad things, and then it deleted its response, and it popped back a message saying, I can't answer questions about that. And I was like, dude, send me the video. So he did. It was early Bing chat. The guy had manipulated the model. It was saying all kinds of horrible things. And then the content moderation caught up. And the content moderation deleted that last horrible response and responded with the right response, like, please stop, I can't do this. But the guy was convinced that was sentient. So I was like, that's just slow content moderation. And you don't see it as much anymore because content moderation has improved. So we deal with all sorts of people, and these, I talk to people that are very, very smart. There's no impact on our humanity or our brains, but they don't understand how the technology works, and they're either fearful or they're overly enthusiastic about capabilities that will not be able to be pulled off by a large language model. So this week, I was manning the NLP booth. My product is visual text analytics. I would say 90% of the questions I answered were about how LLMs work. And that's what I do. So I know I'm probably running up on time. She's not yelling at me yet, but I know she probably will. But I just thinking about that, we're working in an age where the technology has gotten very exciting. Everybody is really jazzed about it. Well, not everybody's really jazzed about it, but most folks are pretty optimistic about some of the things that we're able to do. It's up to us as people who work in technology to understand where it works, how it works, what good use cases are, where the limitations are. So I'm not down on the technology, but I'm definitely here to tell you where it could be used most effectively and what's a really horrible idea. So if you ever have any questions, you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. You're welcome to send me an email. I'm always willing to talk in case you haven't figured that out. But I really appreciate more than anything that at 11:30 on the Friday after the conference technically ended, you guys spent some time with me. So I really appreciate your time, and I'll be standing around here if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Mary.